Welcome to PlanetGeo, the podcast where we talk about our amazing planet, how it works, and why it matters to you.
What are you over there giggling about?
I don't know. You make me laugh.
No. I make you happy, actually.
Yeah, most of the time. Even when you're unhappy, sometimes that makes me laugh.
Okay, but unhappy Chris is not a common Chris, right? Can we agree on that?
That's true. Not unhappy. Ranty Chris makes me happy.
I do get ranty sometimes, yeah. But that's okay. Yeah, I like to rant, though, because I like to talk about things that matter.
Absolutely. So it's good to rant every once in a while.
Today, our re-release of our interview with the director of DARPA, Dr. Stefanie Tompkins. This is my pick.
This is your pick. This is number 5 in our series. This is your pick. I want to hear, I have thoughts on this one. I love this episode too, and it was close to my list as well. But why is it on yours? Why is it top on yours?
A couple of reasons. One, I think it was an underrated episode. By that, I mean, Dr. Tompkins has a very, very important role, the head of DARPA. And so you and I getting to learn about DARPA more and what they've done kind of behind the scenes, I think that was really, really cool. And I think it's absolutely worth revisiting. The other reason is just the idea that how does a geologist rise to this level, to become the director of something that really has nothing to do with geology at all on most days?
I agree with both of those, Chris. Underrated. I think that's right. This is the highest profile person we've ever had on this podcast. And we've had a lot of very successful scientists and geologists out there, but this is the first and only presidential appointee we've ever had. And Dr. Tompkins has a PhD in geology and now is the head of DARPA. I mean, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's just an incredible story. And her take on, the geosciences was really cool. Not only cool, but really important. Like how geology plays a role in national defense is really, really key. And stuff I didn't know, right? So yeah, I think this is a great one to have re-released. It's one of my favorite interviews, if not my favorite interview that we've ever done. I mean, when we send emails to some people, this one, when she replied and was like, yeah, or when her assistant replied and said, yeah, she'd love to come on. We're like, oh, wait, we got to, let's straighten up. Like this is serious, right? That's the way I felt at least. Bring your A game. So yeah, totally cool episode. I'd say let's just get to it. Before we get to it, here are a couple ways to support us. First of all, go to our CampGeo app, first link in the show notes. We have visual podcast series there. Basically, the entire Intro to Geology course that we teach is there for free in audio textbook form. You can also head over to our website, planetgeocast.com. Send us an email, planetgeocast@gmail.com. Let's get to it. All right, Dr. Tompkins, welcome to PlanetGeo. Thanks for joining us, and we're both very excited about this and perhaps a little bit more nervous than some of our other guests, so thanks for joining us here on PlanetGeo.
You know what? It's a real thrill for me to be here. I don't get to spend a lot of my time in my day job among geologists, so I love to be among my people.
Well, I think we might have a few questions before you about that aspect, for sure. We always start out our interviews with this one question, because Chris and I both have this experience of why we get into the geosciences. And Chris was this moment for me. I mean, Chris was the aha moment. So do you have a sort of an aha experience when you sort of light bulb went off and you decided, I'm going to be a geologist?
Well, a couple of different aspects of that answer. First of all, I have to say I'm a little embarrassed to call myself a geologist. I am trained as one, but I don't think I was ever a true practicing geologist in the traditional sense. But, my moment was more of a maybe not the light bulb going off, more like that light alarm that people use that gradually gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And
nice.
It was more of a deciding that physics as a discipline was not for me. Right. So I grew up as an Army brat all over the world, but a good chunk of my childhood and where I consider my hometown is in Kailua, Hawaii. So volcanoes, geology is just sort of part of what everybody thinks about and knows. And when I went to college, I thought I was going to major in physics. And I really wanted to see and touch more stuff than I was going to get in a physics lab. And so through a lot of exploration and asking questions and things like that, I sort of realized that geology was the physics I could touch and at time scales that I really enjoyed.
That's a really good way to phrase it.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, that was my moment. But it was a long moment.
It was a long moment. All right. That's great. That's great. Stefanie, can we talk a little bit about your PhD? was your PhD specifically in? And then the part that I'm really interested in is, did this set you up for your current career path, your current trajectory?
Yeah, it kind of did. So my PhD is in geology, but it's very specifically in planetary geology. And for most of my PhD thesis, I spent a lot of time using remote sensing data of the moon, mapping impact craters on the moon and using those as probes of what was happening underground. It turns out that the sides of craters and the little mountains in the middle of these craters actually come from deeper underground. And if you can identify their composition, that tells you what the subsurface crust is made of. So that was, it's kind of interesting because I went to geology because I wanted to be able to touch it. And then I ended up doing so much of my research in geology that requires satellites with imagers to get the data for me.
So were you mapping the topography or the chemistry? I didn't quite follow, or both?
So the mineralogy. So really the chemistry,
gotcha.
Right? So we were looking for, we were using spectral reflected light that gave us information about the minerals that were on the moon.
Were you looking at these mass cons?
No, the mass cons, in fact, a lot of times the mass cons are a little underground. These are the mass concentrations that give you strong gravity signals. If you look at lunar craters like Copernicus, which is on the near side of the moon, if you look at it, in the middle are these little mountains. And they're called central peaks. And it turns out that when something impacts the moon to create this crater, there's a shock wave that goes down into the deep into the ground, and it rebounds. And as it comes back up, it sucks up rock from deeper than the depth of the crater itself. And so you get this little window into something from much, much deeper. And if you can map the mineralogy of the central peak, you now know something about what's going on much deeper than you can actually see on the surface.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So the impact crater equivalent of a road cut. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. That's nice. So you went back to physics and used your physics, I'm guessing, a lot. Like a lot of the spectral stuff is sort of mineral physics. Yes. Like the spectral reflections and things like that. So did that scratch the physics itch enough for you?
It did a lot, although I think by that point I was just wholly into the geology world. And there's a lot of physics in the impact cratering process, but I stood on the shoulders of geophysicists who had already figured most of that out. What I had was access to new data. There was this mission that happened back many years ago called Clementine, which sent a bunch of instruments to use remote sensing data, and they were mapping the moon. And I was one of the students who happened to be in the right place at the right time when they were getting this whole new influx of data from the far side of the moon. So it was a lot of luck and timing. Let's say that.
Oh, but isn't that, that's graduate school, right? Like being I feel I was definitely in the right place, right time kind of situation. The early Earth sort of interest in the early Earth took off at a time when, and some new rocks were discovered. And so to kind of come back to the second part of Chris's question, I'm really interested in this because I think, well, a little bit of a backstory. A doctor I know recommended you. I think he had worked at DARPA and knew you, had worked as a medical doctor at DARPA and recommended you and sort of said, well, there's a geologist as the head of DARPA, Dr. Stefanie Tompkins. And I was like, what? Really? A geologist is the head of DARPA? That's amazing. Can we possibly talk to her? And so I guess the question is, did that planetary science PhD, did it set you up for your eventual career or was it kind of a deviation? And if it did set you up, like how did it? Because Chris and I deal with students all the time. They might look at you and say, hey, I want to be that. How do I go be that? And so, I don't know, can you talk us through that personal experience?
So the correct answer is yes, it did. And it in a couple of ways. So most directly, it taught me a lot about remote sensing. And there were a number of people who said, hey, if it turns out you don't want a career in NASA, which I certainly hadn't, I was very interested in, that you could take all of those remote sensing skills and instead of pointing them at the moon, you could point them at the Earth. And there's a lot of really interesting work in the Earth observation and particularly in the defense world where your skill set could come in handy. And I was maybe more open to that than most because I had served in the Army before graduate school. So the idea of national security and defense wasn't a complete new thing to me. But absolutely, the skill sets that I learned, I would say many, many things that I learned, not just my thesis, but so many aspects of geology were foundational to my ability to do my job today. And I'm happy to talk more about that because I'm really passionate about the fact that geology sets you up for amazing opportunities in many spaces.
Yeah, I think could you, I guess, expound on that? Because I don't know, I feel the same way that geology is this, and especially in this new modern era of the entire energy budget of humanity is going through this transition, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I don't know, Chris and I were just talking a couple nights ago about how it's a good time to be a geologist, a particularly good time to be a geologist these days. So yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts on that aspect.
Sure. You know, so much of what we think of, what is exciting people today in science and technology is multidisciplinary, right? We spend a lot of time trying to get people out of their silos. You're not just a chemist, you're not just a physicist, but maybe the problem needs to be solved at the boundaries between those different disciplines. And geology is just inherently multidisciplinary. You know, you have to know some physics, you have to know some chemistry, you may need some biology, you certainly need some math, and you need a lot of common sense. And, you know, maybe this kind of forensic way of thinking, of problem solving, all of those things turn out to be super valuable in a whole variety of careers, even if you're never looking at actual rocks. And so I feel like that thought process is most important. But there's also different aspects of geology. I think I heard you on a previous podcast talking about, you know, tool sets. It was when you were interviewing one of the scientists out at Yellowstone. And he was saying that it's not enough just to like being in the field. You need these different sets, right? So in graduate school, I learned a lot about petrology and about ternary diagrams. And I work a lot now with material scientists. And it turns out that petrology and material science, it's kind of really foundationally very similar. And we talk the same language. I work a lot with people who do complex optimization, sort of mathematical problems. And my geophysical inverse theory class has really come in handy in helping me, not like I couldn't do what they do, but I can grasp what they're doing and the importance and the relevance of it.
Okay, so you can communicate with the same sort of language and sort of mental hierarchy or something along those lines.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I like that. I like that the phrase geology is inherently multidisciplinary. That's nice. I'm going to use that. I'm going to steal that one and use it in class for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So, Stefanie, I want to transition a little bit and talk a little bit about DARPA specifically. It has this huge reputation and actual legacy in research, okay? You know, you had a role in the mRNA vaccine. You know, you invested early on in the internet. I mean, that's crazy. I didn't know this, by the way, until I started preparing for this interview. What is the mission of DARPA today? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I love talking about DARPA. So you'll probably have to stop me when I've gone on too much. But
I have so many questions about DARPA. We will definitely run over time if we start too far down this train.
Okay. Well, I'll give you the high level version first. DARPA was started 65 years ago. And it was directly in response to the launch of the Sputnik satellite by what was then the Soviet Union. And that event was this incredible kind of technological surprise for the nation. It was like, holy cow, who knew that they could do that? And we didn't like being surprised. And so a whole bunch of stuff happened. The government moves very quickly when they're put into a state of shock. And they created some organizations. One of them actually became NASA. And one of them was called ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. And over the years, we have either been sort of ARPA or DARPA. We have been DARPA for a long time now. But the mission of DARPA, or ARPA back then, was to prevent that type of technological surprise from happening again. Now, if you think about it, it's hard to just prevent surprise. That would mean that you had a crystal ball. But what the people have sort of historically and evolved to interpreting that to be is to be the ones who are creating it. Because if you're creating the surprise and you're always out there 10, 20 years in advance in terms of what's possible, then it's much less likely that someone else is going to do something, at least technologically, that will shock you. And so because of that, it's been this organization that's worked somewhat independently, really focusing on disruptive and breakthrough, innovations that if we are successful, change everything. But if we fail, the rest of the research ecosystem can march forward on whatever it was they were already doing. So we're kind of these outsiders with a specific role of potentially disrupting for the better. And obviously a strong national security focus. So,
Stefanie, two things jumped to my mind as I listened to you answer that question. One is it more of a defensive kind of thing? Like I think of cybersecurity. Is that the kind of thing that you talk about in terms of preventing surprises? And the other thing that I think of is offensive. Like, are you involved also in the development of military technology and things like that?
Yeah, we are definitely involved in both. So preventing surprise has a heavy defense element onto it. But one of the things you start to find out is that often those are two sides of the same coin. You know, if you are defending something, you need a much better understanding of what you're defending against. If people are working on new offensive capabilities, then you better be thinking about how you would defend against those same things. And it's sort of complicated, right? And, I'll say this up front. It is a field, the defense community, in which many of us think very hard about the ethical, legal, societal implications of what we're creating. And we concentrate on that heavily at DARPA. We don't wash our hands and say, we build it, someone else figures out how to use it. We think hard about the ethics of it and try to build that into the thought process that we go through. But yes, fundamentally, all kinds of defense technologies.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
It's really interesting because, in this, like Chris, I knew DARPA from the research sort of legacy side, which I have a bunch of questions about, of like, DARPA being this go fast and break things kind of, really transformative things, high failure rate, like go fast, go fast, go fast. I have a bunch of questions about that. But in researching this DARPA thing, you see all sorts of quotes from things like, oh, it's the agency that shaped the modern world, to like, weapons of future war agency, and all these sort of different takes on DARPA, I guess. And so it's interesting to hear you sort of from the insider's view give that perspective to it. I guess, how does being a geologist, being your geology background, do you frame that conversation that internal conversation differently than your colleagues? I suppose that's what kind of, I think my question is, like, how do you experience it differently? Or I guess, and maybe we have to go back a little bit to ask about I think you worked as an Army intelligence officer between graduate school and undergrad. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So that, that's a different, that's a heck of a gap year sort of thing. Some people take gap years between undergrad and graduate school. That's a different take on it. And maybe, I don't know, do you have a different personal experience than other people at DARPA in this regard?
Maybe. Obviously, I don't necessarily know what their experiences are. So first of all, the gap year, the gap 4 years, was a natural consequence of not being able to afford college. Right. So I went to undergrad on an ROTC scholarship and had this really easy option of not having to attend career fairs or do anything because I knew I was already committed to a job. While I was in my officer basic course at Fort Huachuca, it occurred to me that maybe I should go ahead and take the GREs just in case. Drove up to University of Arizona in Tucson and was taking them and wandered into the geology building because I had some time off and decided that I might really want to come back and do this someday. But that's that's sort of to explain that gap time period. And that was back in the days when you had to write to colleges.
So that was 4 years. And then as soon as you finished your 4 years, you went back to graduate school. Okay.
I went to graduate school. Exactly. Yeah, in a time, again, for your listeners, where you had to write a letter and ask for a brochure.
Sure.
And also, Stefanie, taking the GRE. I mean, you probably took the geology-specific GRE, didn't you?
I don't remember if I did or not. Okay. I suspect I might have done both, right? I feel like there was a pretty generalized test as well. But to your question about whether or not I think about my job differently, I think that geology certainly lets you think in terms of long timescales. It helps me. I'm a human and I'm vulnerable. My brain does the same thing. Under pressure, you sort of react to maybe in ways that aren't super helpful to stress and to pressure and things like that. I have practice maybe from the geology world of taking a step back and looking at sort of billions of years and trying to, sometimes that does help. I think the whole multidisciplinary, the Earth system science, the whole idea of taking that back and thinking about systems as systems has often been something that's natural for me. I mean, not me biologically or in my DNA, but because it was trained into me. But whether that is significantly different than a lot of my colleagues who simply got here by other paths, I'm not sure that I could say.
That's an interesting point because we do just get exposed to million-year, billion-year timescales all the time. So I don't know, I think we sort of take it for granted sitting on a rock thinking, wow, this is a 350 million-year-old, sediment. We sort of take that longevity for granted in many ways. But I could see how this would definitely change your perspective on questions like you were speaking about as far as DARPA goes. Sorry, Chris, I think I interrupted you there.
No, that's okay. I was just going to move on because Stefanie, I've heard you talk about, particularly in reference to your job at DARPA, about failure a few times. And you have this refreshing take on failure. Can you just give us an example of a sort of failure or flop that happened that turned out to be a good flop?
Absolutely. You actually mentioned early on, you mentioned our role in mRNA vaccines. So let me tell you a story about that. Once upon a time, I don't know, maybe 15, 16 years ago, DARPA was making a run at creating artificial blood for the battlefield. So you imagine in battlefield conditions, the idea of sitting people down and drawing blood so that you can, transfer it to somebody else, not the most practical thing. Artificial blood would be a really great thing. We failed at that. Not because we weren't able to make artificial blood, but it turns out that what we were able to demonstrate was too expensive to be practical. All right, so we failed. Program was done. DARPA focuses heavily on a rotation model. Our people are typically rotating in and out on about a 4 to 5 year cycle. So a new program manager came in and he took over the remnants of that program. And in the process of sort of closing it out, he started asking different questions. And one of the questions he asked was, if we have expensive artificial blood, is there anything you could do with that blood that would make it worth the cost? Could you, for example, cure people with it? Or could you prevent disease? And he held workshops and talked to different people. And the exact sequence of events, I can't tell you because I wasn't there. But, at least at one of those workshops, there was a little company with maybe a dozen people at the time. It was called Moderna. You might have heard of them. They thought a lot about this idea of transforming how you vaccinate people, how you turn your body and your own blood into a factory to create your immunity. And that led to the program that then really made these massive investments in mRNA and in DNA-related vaccines. So that's the story did come out of a failure. And by the way, we're making another run at artificial blood. So
really?
we're going to try again. Yeah.
Oh, cool. That is such a cool story. I'd never heard that artificial blood side before. I mean, I only heard the quote, DARPA funded Moderna early on, but that's a great backstory to it. That's really cool. So I guess that brings up a really quick question. What is the distribution of funding between sort of like startup companies, established entities, government, research labs, or universities? I don't know. I don't actually know that. Do you fund all, any comers, any takers, basically?
Yeah, we fund all of the above.
Okay. Gotcha.
I don't think I could give you an accurate sense of the distribution, and it will really vary year by year. I know that I think last year maybe 18 or 19% was universities, like university-led projects, but definitely large companies. We actually have a very large percentage of small companies that we fund, higher than I think a lot of other government organizations, because they tend to be real creative and a little more risk tolerant.
Yeah, real risky, I'm sure, too. That's cool. Really cool. Maybe that's a good transition because I have a bunch of questions about like the funding structure, because I live in maybe the more traditional funding structure at university, which you're familiar with, I'm sure, from your experience at School of Mines, but NSF and things like that, things are slow and research takes a long time in many ways. And so DARPA has this huge, like, bigger than real, reputation for being really fast and fast moving. And I think you've sort of described academia as having a role in the national security infrastructure, I guess, ecosystem. And how do you view that fitting? If you're funding some universities, which are, I think we tend to think slow. Maybe we move slower. We think big maybe, but move slowly at many times, in part because we have PhD students and master students and undergrads, right? We're kind of doing this training and research at the same time. So how do you view that? Or why does academia have a role?
So let's just look at the ecosystem in general, right? And this can be national security, or it could be really anything. If you think about this research and development or science and technology ecosystem, you have got universities, you have industry and nonprofit research organizations, and you have government labs. You have all of these organizations working together, loosely connected, not in some harmonious system, but they're all sort of working to gradually advance the state of the art in science and technology. And then within that role, DARPA has this disruption that we're kind of there on the side. We swoop in and we accelerate something because it looks exciting. The universities often play a role in helping to make really dramatic advances in that more basic early stage research. It might be, for example, that they're making the big discovery, which then after they're done, we start a new program that would work with more industry players to help mature it much more quickly. And we have so much flexibility in our structure of how we start and stop programs that we're able to sort of see a bunch of paths and use money and creative processes to like accelerate that technology from step to step much more quickly. I will say that, so the universities are a really fundamental part of the S&T ecosystem. And within DARPA, we love them, but it is probably a small subset.
Did you say S&T ecosystem there?
Yeah, sorry, science and technology.
Okay, there we go. Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah. It is a very small percentage of faculty members that probably love working with DARPA for the exact reasons you said.
Yeah.
Right? And there is some types of research that are fundamentally mismatched to our model. You know, some things really are going to take 20 years and you need to do the entire thing before you figure it out. Our cycles of 3 to 5 years, real quick, fail fast, it isn't going to work for everything, and it's certainly not going to work for everyone. So when I talk to universities, I do spend a lot of time trying to help them like look at themselves and say, am I that person that wants to get on the roller coaster, or do I need to be left alone, and help them figure out whether DARPA is really a good fit for them?
That's interesting because I just last week, sorry, Chris, just one real quick story. I had an alumni, it works for a company, and approached me about maybe being involved in a DARPA proposal for the critical minerals thing, which I'd love to talk more about. But it was a little bit intimidating, I must admit, from my perspective. It was like, wow, these are timelines. These are strict timelines. I'm not used to dealing with those kind of timelines and turnarounds, even though it's very exciting, the opportunity. It didn't end up going forward. So we don't have a proposal, submitted to you guys, but that's an interesting perspective. Sorry, Chris.
No, that's okay. Stefanie, does DARPA then essentially, because it's all about speed, right? I assume that's why your model is you have 3 to 5 years to work here. It's all, let's get things done fast. Is that a good?
It is very much so. Very much about speed. Yeah.
So how do you take the chains off? How do you do this?
Question.
Like how does that happen?
And maybe do you have an example
the restraints
of that,
away?
Fundamental?
Yeah.
Do you have like a geoscience example you could kind of walk us through the lifetime of, or time frames of, maybe, or something along those lines?
Yeah, let me think about it. But let me start with the framework, right? So everything in the DARPA business process, the organization has a lot of structures built into it that naturally fight human nature, where human nature is usually geared to slow down and to get comfortable, right? And so one of the things I often say is, you come to DARPA and right around the time you get really comfortable with how we do things, which is maybe 3 or 4 years in, we kick you out. And knowing that the clock is ticking, right? That we said, come to DARPA, we're going to give you money, freedom, flexibility, all the contacts and support you need to change the world, but we're only going to let you have 4 years. That drives
That's so cool.
people to just behave differently, right? So you have to know there's an end. And by no means would that work everywhere, and it shouldn't. You only need to do it in a small number of organizations because you need the rest of that ecosystem to be working at a steadier pace. But that is sort of how we structure it. So we are constantly probing our program managers, as they're creating new programs, to really focus on what's the miracle that they need to demonstrate in order to move to the next step. And rather than trying to construct a 10-year or a 20-year program the way you might in another organization, prove that one thing out or fail. And then everything in our structure is geared around being able to move quickly so that if you're successful, we can put more money on it really quickly and advance. Or if you failed, you know what? That's fine because you've got more ideas and let's try something new.
Okay.
Does that help?
Can I ask? Yeah, that does. Where did this model come from? And was this DARPA's right when it started? Is this the idea?
Probably not quite this way. A lot of things have evolved over time, but it is one that I think elements of it were there from the very beginning. But the processes to help make it happen, like the idea of these short tenures, have evolved over the last several decades where it wasn't just suggested, but it became sort of codified in how we do business.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
Wow, cool.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
All right.
It sounds so exciting. Yeah, that's awesome.
So, Stefanie, I have a question for you. I am very interested in the special forces and what you do in developing technology for them. Do you have a division of DARPA that's devoted to military technology and then another division that's devoted to these kind of enabling technologies? How's that set?
So I understand your question. So the way DARPA is organized, we have 6 technical offices. And by the way, those are not fixed in time. Those can be reorganized or anything like that. But we have 6 technical offices. And then we have a whole support team. Remember I said that, DARPA people, we kick them out. Our support people stay long term. So all the people that do IT and security and human resources, and they are stable and they provide our corporate memory. Now, within the technical parts of DARPA, we have some offices that lean much more heavily towards basic research, which means a lot more university interaction. And by definition, a lot more of that enabling technology that you're asking about. And that could be anything from a new type of a microscope, which isn't the thing that the military will use directly, but it could accelerate science in a whole new way, to a new radio or a new microchip or a new airplane or a new satellite, right? So there's the enabling technologies. And then we have other offices that lean much more to those military systems, the aircraft or the new ship or the new communications network. But we try not to have walls between them. The idea is the program manager is a DARPA program manager, and if they've got an idea that could change the world, it shouldn't matter where they sit as to what they can do. So they're very flexible, but they're homeroomed. I sort of think of these offices as homerooms where they get lots of support and lots of help, but they can work in any office that they want to. But fundamentally, when I look at DARPA accomplishments over history, I do sort of divide them up between the things that are more enabling, like the ARPANET, which became the internet, or material science, or the more clear military technologies like stealth aircraft or miniaturized GPS receivers. And the idea is that DARPA is working on all of those, but we don't try to box people into one category or another.
Okay, maybe let's get into the geology part of this, because I'll admit I sent a relatively searching email and I was not expecting a response when I sent an email and said, "Oh, Dr. Tompkins, would you be like to come on our podcast?" So I guess you seem like a very thoughtful person. Why did you agree to come on a geology podcast as the head of DARPA? Apart from you just being a geologist by training, what about geology is interesting? And why is a geologist the head of DARPA? Frankly, I guess that's part of the question. Chris and I were big proponents of geoscience, but that doesn't mean we're right. So I would like to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. Well, so the idea of why a geologist is the head of DARPA is probably more of a coincidence. I am 99% sure that the people who were doing the search for the DARPA director were not looking for a geologist. They were just looking with the right mixture of experience, and all of the time and the things that I've done, I think helped to prepare me to be able to do this job. Hopefully reasonably well. I'm super passionate about DARPA and I want it to be successful. But why I came on, it's tied to a little bit of what we talked about before, which is how passionate I am that geology, the training of geology, prepares you for much more than just being a geologist. And I feel like so much of the geological background has helped me at different stages in my career to do non-geological things that I would love to help get that message out to lots of people that, one, if you can get an amazing job as a geologist, you should, because it's awesome. But if you can't, or if you choose to do something else, the geology is still an amazing background. And I often push a lot of people who don't quite know what they want. I'll say, well, you know what? If you major in geology, you could do anything. So
okay.
that's
a good one.
Part of that message. But let's be fair, too. I'm human. And the shallower, simple answer, which is I don't get to talk to geologists a lot. And having a chance to do that is kind of a treat, was part of my thinking as well.
Well, that's good, too. I guess maybe, Chris, if you allow me, I'll ask the question, slightly different question, because I think what I heard was a little bit like geoscientists can have a lot of careers like that. I guess another question that comes to mind is, does geology have a role in national defense? Or maybe not geology like their traditional hammering on rocks, but geoscience maybe, like the broader thing, pointing your instruments towards Earth. Is there a role for geoscience in national defense as well as geoscientists, I guess?
Certainly. There is at every level. If you think about it from the sea floor, the ocean, the Earth and the subsurface, up through the atmosphere. At every level, whether you're thinking, the Navy is probably a great example when you think about this, because they have to understand oceanography pretty well. Actually, they pay a lot of attention to the stars, too. We still do a lot of star-based navigation in the DoD. There's a lot of underground aspects of national security, things that underground facilities, tunnels, detecting tunnels, stuff like that, where you have a much more traditional set of geologists. You might remember, I don't know, you might not be old enough, but, back in the day, there were videos with Osama bin Laden would be, somewhere remote, right? And it was geologists who were figuring out where he was based on the rocks that were surrounding him.
Oh, is that right? I
So
did not know that.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, lots of really cool.
Wow.
It's not usually like front and center the way aerospace engineering might be,
Sure.
but it is very much part of the fabric of national security at many, many different levels.
Okay,
That
I
was
like that.
really
That's
interesting.
that's
Yeah.
it. I like that. Okay, so a little bit of backstory to this question, Stephanie. Chris and I are terrible at naming episodes, and we almost always fight about naming episodes. And I guess, what would you name this episode? This is the first time we've ever asked anybody this, but I think it would maybe say a lot about your perspective on how you sort of view geoscience and national security. I don't know. Do you have a name that comes to mind for a podcast episode, a geology podcast that you're on, or not?
Well, let's start by saying that I am probably very much like you. I'm terrible at naming things. When I was a DARPA program manager, my programs they never had cute acronyms. They were super boring. And the best thing about my job is I had this team of people who I can say, some long, boring thing to describe it, and they will come back with a really cute name. But, I think I would love for it to be something that reflects this idea of a geologist in non-geology territory, like a geologist in strange lands or something. This idea of the ability to take what you have learned and put it to good in many other different disciplines.
Oh, I like that. Well, I can tell you you're not worse than Chris at naming. I mean, I come up with great names all the time, and Chris comes up with some real terrible ones. Oh, my goodness.
All right.
They're the worst.
All right, Chris, you and me, we'll have coffee together and we'll celebrate our geeky, non-exciting naming
There you go.
conventions.
But that's interesting you don't
That's
have
a plan.
I feel like, Stephanie, the seismologists are the only ones who come up with good acronyms. Like, I can't come up with an acronym to save my life, but every seismologist I know has like these amazing little acronyms that they're really good at. And I don't know, it's something about being a seismologist. So,
Well, I'm actually shocked by your answer, Stephanie, because the DoD, I mean, that's what you live on, are acronyms. I mean, DARPA, for instance. I mean, that's crazy. All right, Stephanie. So you're on a geology podcast. I feel like we need to ask you something geologically. So here's my go at this. What is the most interesting geologic place that you've ever been, and why?
Okay, let me think. There's probably more than one.
Okay, well, you can talk about more than one.
Let's pick the one that might be the most unusual, and it was certainly interesting. When I was a second lieutenant in the Army, serving in Korea, very close and basically right along the demilitarized zone. And I don't know if you know this, but the North Koreans over time have dug a lot of tunnels under the DMZ, potential invasion routes. And several of them are known. And there was I think it was called the Tunnel Neutralization Team. Basically, there was a team of allies, U.S. and allies, part of whose job was to help find and map and sort of work with these tunnels in order to prevent somebody from invading through them. And my boss at the time happened to have been on that team in the past, so he took a bunch of us on a tour. So I got to walk through one of these tunnels. And just to tell you how sort of mediocre a geologist I am, he held up the first rock and he says, "Okay, geologist," because I was the only one who could answer to that, and said, "What is this?" And I said, "It looks like rubble, sir." He's like, it was a lot of granite, a little bit of gneiss, just so you know. But
I was going to ask, what was the rock?
What was
they
it?
dug it. They dug those tunnels through granite and gneiss.
Yeah.
Holy cow! That's not an easy job.
Right, and it's across the full peninsula, so it will vary. But the opportunity to walk through those tunnels was lots of fun.
That's amazing. So it brings up another question: do you get called out like that a lot, being like the one geologist somewhere, and you get called out for identify this rock? Right? The one geologist on the team. Can you tell me what this rock is? Or do people bring rocks they found in their backyard to identify occasionally?
Not anymore. They used to, but then we reached the stage after graduate school when they would bring me a rock and I would say, well, after you've taken it to a lab and taken a spectrum of it, I will identify it from the spectrum.
Nice. That's a good.
I was okay. I did my field work and I learned a lot, but I never got to practice it enough. So I am not super good with hand samples beyond the real obvious ones that I did in like Geology 101.
Well, I can't identify sediments to save my life. We haven't thought about sediments in a long time, so it's what you're used to, what you look at a lot. So I have another sort of funding question, if you will. You ran technology transfer at the Colorado School of Mines. Is that right? You were the vice president of technology transfer?
Yeah, research and technology transfer. Yeah.
Okay, research and technology transfer. I think most people, I don't think, are aware of these offices at universities. Can you maybe describe what the point of that office is, what you did, and what your experience was like? Because I've actually never interacted with this office at Penn State. I don't know. Can you put that into context for us, what that role
Absolutely.
is?
There's both sort of a philosophical view of that, kind of the big vision of what it means, and then there is the very practical day-to-day. So if you really I'm going to start philosophically because I'm a big believer in public research universities, and I just, what they have done for the nation is amazing and what they continue to do. But if you think about it, at a university, one, you are creating knowledge because knowledge is not static. So the research is part of what you're doing to create the knowledge. And then you have a mission to get that knowledge out, the fruits of that knowledge out to the world. And one way you do that, the really obvious way, is you do that through students, right? But also you do that by getting your technology into the hands of companies, or usually companies or some organization that can put it to use. So sometimes at the very practical sense, that means that a university faculty member has made a discovery, they have filed a patent on it, and now the tech transfer office helps to work to get that patented technology licensed to a company that could put it to use. Or they will help the faculty member potentially, form a startup company that can do something with that technology. But it is really the very practical and business aspects of moving that technology from the laboratory and out into practical utility.
So a follow-up question. I'm really big into sort of entrepreneurship and how that fits in. And so did you deal with a lot of faculty entrepreneurs who sort of started a company on the backs of what they'd done in their research? Or was it is there a lot more licensing than sort of in-house startups, I suppose,
Yeah.
or startups birthed in the university?
So the answer is going to actually depend on the university. So at Mines, it was more licensing. We certainly had some startups. It was more heavily on licensing. At other universities, it'll flip. And I'll tell you why. Among the tech transfer community, there is sort of this saying, and I don't know if it's still true. So you had these invention disclosures before you file a patent. So for every invention disclosure that makes like significant money in the future, I'm trying to remember the numbers, but it might be something as grim as like every 1,000 of them or something. But let's say every 100 of them, only 6 are ever going to make real money. And of those 6, 4 are going to be biotech, 1 is going to be software, and 1 is going to be everything else.
Oh, really?
So at a university like Mines, where you don't have a medical school and you're not doing heavy in the biotech, by definition, you're sort of pushed into that everything else category. So the incentives for startups and the investment funding and things like that to support that is not as strong outside the biotech world. So you'll see a shift from university to university depending on where their research strengths are. So the bottom line is everybody has to do both, but you might get better at some than others depending on what your faculty are actually doing.
Would you see that changing? And maybe this brings up, I think I've seen a couple DARPA calls for like sort of critical minerals, artificial minerals, I think was when I saw a call for funding or a call for proposals. Would you see that changing from the geosciences, given how much massive investment is going into carbon sequestration and critical minerals and groundwater, maybe even nuclear energy, uranium deposits? I mean, would you see that kind of shifting on the horizon, that geoscience startup culture becomes a bigger part maybe, or not?
Yeah, I actually can imagine that it could. I think that certainly with climate and energy and opportunities like that, you'll see a lot more of it. You have to think from the sides of the investors, which is where do they have the best guarantee on investment? For a lot of reasons historically, first of all, software is easy because you don't have to put a lot of money in and you can potentially get a lot of money out. Biotech has just been so huge. No reason why you wouldn't start to expect to see more in some of these other domains. I think especially if you can potentially accelerate them more with the aid of machine learning and things like that. So there might be a lot more bets that can be placed in the coming years.
Stefanie, does DARPA dabble or invest in climate technology? Is that a part of defense?
It's absolutely part of our portfolio. A number of years ago, there was a naval officer, I think the head of oceanography for the Navy, who made this comment that said, I'm not going to argue about what or why is happening, but there's a whole new ocean opening up in the Arctic, and I would like to be able to know something about that. So we have to deal with climate and also with weather as well. But so we have We have no restrictions on it, but DARPA is very bottoms up. We bring these program managers in and we say change the world. And so we have a few that are really looking with great interest at, impacts of like coastal, like sea level rise. So we have a program called Refence, which looks at hybrid natural artificial reefs off coastlines, things like that. So yeah, so it is certainly part of our overall portfolio.
I mean, this program manager job seems like the greatest job in the world. How does one become a program manager at DARPA? This sounds amazing. Are you taking applications?
We are always looking. Given that we're kicking them out at such a high rate, it means that a significant part of all of our jobs is recruiting new PMs. If you are interested in changing the world and you feel like, a lot of times it's like, the things that you want to do, no one else is willing to take a risk on. It's like, come to DARPA and make it happen here. And then you can when you're done, you either go back to where you came from or we'll help you find your next great job. So you can contact us through our website. Anybody out there that's interested, that's probably the simplest way to
nobody else is allowed. I'm going to apply and I don't want anybody else. Look, I just want my application in this cycle. So
Stefanie, I imagine how do you get people, because they probably have to leave an already lucrative job to come to DARPA, probably, right? A lot of times. They
do indeed. And I'm sure you'll be shocked to know that the government is not the highest paid job they're ever going to have. Yeah. So we have a lot of special hiring authorities. That means that we have been given legal authority by the government to hire people with different processes than the normal government hiring. So I can actually hire somebody in a week and I can offer salaries that they're not going to match Silicon Valley level industry, but they are higher than typical government because they are temporary by definition. And so we can help, meet in the middle often. And what we offer them is a variety the kinds of problems they can work on and the freedom and flexibility that they have. For a lot of people, it's worth it to take slightly less salary for a while. And as I said, we also help them find like where they're going to go next so that when they're done, they're not out on the street with a tin cup, right? So our DARPA alumni have done amazing things, and
wow,
this is such an interesting model.
Yeah.
I
love it.
It really is.
Love it. I absolutely love it.
Yeah.
Sounds so cool, so inspiring. Real quick, before we get to our final question, I have one. We're geologists, so what's your favorite rock, Stefanie? Do you have one? Do you have a specific rock that you have in your house? Do you still have a rock collection, somewhere in your house? Or do you have like a general rock that's your favorite, a category of rocks that's your favorite?
So for a specific rock, I am working in Virginia right now because of this job. My home is still back home in Colorado. But in my home in Colorado, I know I have a nice hand sample size piece of chert that I picked up when I was in field camp in Montana. And I actually don't really understand, all the origins of it, but I fell in love with it then and I have carried it everywhere since. So that's my favorite personal rock.
Heartwarming. I love that. This is a rock that's traveled with you all around. I love that. That's great.
Yeah.
You have
it's sort of smooth and nice to hold. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it reminds you of field camp, right?
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
that's warm, fuzzy feelings. That's right.
Indeed. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Stefanie, our final question, because we're running out of time here. We always end with this. What has been your best day or favorite day as a geoscientist?
Wow.
And you can take that any direction you want to go.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be you as a geoscientist either. We'll accept anything from your career, maybe. That geoscience set you up for very nicely. Maybe let's qualify it as that.
Yeah. One of the best and also hardest parts about being at DARPA is that we have amazing days every day, right? I get to learn something new or people have breakthroughs every single day. So I don't know. It would take me a while to sift through. Let's say this, and maybe this is for those members of your audience that are a little bit more like the student that I was a long time. The day that I passed my PhD exams was amazing because I was the most mediocre undergraduate student you could ever imagine. It was quite shocking that I got into graduate school at all. The Army work ethic helped a lot. I changed how I was thinking about things. And the fact that I became super passionate about something and was able to be successful in it and prove that I could do something that I never would have imagined was a pretty big moment for me. So
that's really cool.
And at that moment, by definition, I was the closest to being a pure geoscientist as a newly minted PhD, right? So what more could you ask?
That's amazing. And that's a great lesson. I think great could come from anywhere. Like, you don't have to be all A's all the time to go on to be the head of DARPA. Like, you just, I don't know. That's a really cool story. Thank you so much, Stefanie, for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for dedicating an hour, being so gracious with your time. And you can look forward to my application for program manager at DARPA pretty
I will
soon.
be looking for it. And thank you so much. This was a real thrill for me.
This was so fun.
Being able to chat with you guys. Yeah.
It was so nice to meet you, Stefanie.
Next time we'll talk
Same
more
here.
geology.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Stefanie.
Have a good rest of your day. All right.
You
bye.
too.
All right.